Welcome, everyone. We're in the middle of Hilchos Tzitzis and Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, chapter 9. I believe we're up to number Sif Yud, number 10. Unfortunately, last week I paused the recording in the middle to access the video, and then I forgot to put it back on, so the last 10-15 minutes are missing. Hope it doesn't happen again. If you notice that, do point it out. But anyway, I believe we're up to number Yud. Okay. If you take off your talis with the intention of putting it on again immediately, even if you did so for the purpose.
You can shift either way. Then I was like, no, that's embarrassing walking with a bag.
Am I asking a question there? Or?
Sorry.
All right. If you take off your talis with the intention of putting it on again immediately, even if you do so for the purpose of going to the lavatory, when you return and put it on again, you do not recite a bracha over the talis. Now, the emphasis, even if you did so in the purpose of going to the lavatory, in the next chapter where we learn the laws of tefillin, we'll see that in certain cases you do have to make a bracha again on the tefillin if you went to the lavatory, because it's forbidden to wear the tefillin in the lavatory. So even though there was only a short amount of time elapsed, nevertheless, that is considered a hefsek. It's considered a sort of hard cut interruption between your first wearing of the tefillin and the second wearing, because it was interrupted by you entering a place where it was forbidden to wear the tefillin. We'll discuss that more in the following chapter. Whereas the talis, even though it's the custom to take off your talis before you go into the bathroom, nevertheless, strictly speaking, it's permissible to wear it there, and therefore you do not make a bracha again on the talis if it was just for a short amount of time, right? Since it's permissible to enter the lavatory with it, it is therefore not considered an interruption. However, if your intention was not to put on the talis again immediately, and then you changed your mind and did put it on again, so let's say it's Shabbos, you finished davening Shachris, whatever it is, you take off your talis, you're planning to put it on again sometime later. It's questionable exactly how much time, but let's say a couple of hours, let's say even a few hours to be safe. You're not going to daven Musaf till a few hours later. So then you would have to make another bracha, because that time would be considered an interruption. And then you changed your mind and you decided to put it on again right away. You must recite the bracha over it. I actually once saw that we had an interesting case in my room in the dormitory. So the custom is that for people who do not have a talis for davening, to change the tzitzis every day. This is based on the following calculation. The custom is, tzitzis, we've sort of alluded to this, but tzitzis, the mitzvah of tzitzis is during the daytime. Now, there's two opinions as to what that means. One opinion is that the shita of the Rosh, that the mitzvah of tzitzis applies to a garment that is a daytime garment, and the other opinion is that it only applies during daytime hours. Now, according to the Rosh, who holds that a daytime garment is obligated to wear tzitzis, so then if you have the tzitzis, which is a daytime garment, and you wear it at night, then you're fulfilling the mitzvah at night. So that, for that reason, and also for Kabbalistic reasons, for both of those reasons, it's customary that we wear tzitzis at night, and it's something which in Chabad, the Rebbe pushed very strongly. If I recall correctly, the Rebbe told somebody that it was a segula for a heart condition that he had, or other similar things, but we very strongly encourage wearing tzitzis at night. Now, the problem becomes, as we learned last week at the end of number 9, that if you wear tzitzis at night, if you slept while wearing a small talis, you can't recite the bracha on it at all. Why can't you recite the bracha on it? According to the Rambam, you could recite the bracha on it, because according to the Rambam, the nighttime you happened to be wearing the tzitzis, but it was no mitzvah. So now the morning comes, you had a 12-hour gap of no mitzvah, so you can make another bracha. But according to the Rosh, again, provided that this is not pajama tzitzis, but it's a tzitzis, a garment that you also wear during the daytime, then you've been fulfilling the mitzvah all night. So do you make a bracha or not? So if you have a talis, so then there's no problem. When you recite the bracha in the talis, you have intention to include a small talis. That's what we learned last week. But if you don't have a talis, for example, as is the Chabad custom that unmarried men, the Bachrim, don't wear a talis. So the best thing to do is if you change your tzitzis every morning you wake up, you change it. And like this, it's a new mitzvah, even according to the Rosh, you can recite the bracha. So I remember one time a roommate of mine woke up in the morning and he took off his tzitzis to change into his, it was just alternating every day. And he took off his tzitzis and he couldn't find the other tzitzis. I won't tell you how tidy the room was. And so right away, he just put on the same tzitzis that he had just taken off and made another bracha on them, because that's exactly this point. His intention was not to put it back on immediately, and then he changed his mind to put it back on again, and he recites the bracha. Okay, if your talis fell off accidentally, then if part of it remained on your body, regardless, even if most of it fell off, as long as a part of the mitzvah remained upon you, you are not required to repeat the bracha when you readjust the talis. Right? So it's falling off and you manage to catch it before it's completely slipped off of you, then no new bracha. However, if none of the talis remains on your body, although you are holding it in your hand, so even it's not over your body, it's just over your arms, right? Or then your hand. Then, since no part of the mitzvah remains on your body, for the mitzvah is not to hold the talis in your hand, but for the body to be wrapped in it, then you must therefore say a bracha when you put on the talis again. So this can happen, especially if you have the Chabad talis, which has silk on the inside, and you have a Chabad kapata, which is silk, so it's very slippery, and then you are honored with hagba, and you have both of your hands up in the air holding the Sefer Torah, and your talis slips off. So if it falls all the way off, then the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch rules that you do have to say the bracha again. And if this happens to you during prayers at a point when you are not permitted to interrupt, you should not recite the blessing then, but wait and instead until you are permitted to recite the bracha, at which point you should grasp the tzitzis in your head and recite the bracha. Now, Lamaisa, this is the rule in Shulchan Aruch, and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch rules accordingly. But nevertheless, many poskim point out that it's not customary to do this, that even if the talis falls all the way off, you don't recite the bracha again. And I'll just point out two things which are relevant to us who follow the rulings of the Alter Rebbe. Number one, there is a comment from the Alter Rebbe in the Siddur, and we know that the Alter Rebbe in the Piskei HaSiddur is the later writings of the Alter Rebbe. So if there's a difference between what the Alter Rebbe writes in Shulchan Aruch versus what the Alter Rebbe writes in the Siddur, we follow what he says in the Siddur because that means he changed his mind later on in life. However, often the Siddur, which wasn't written to be a code of law, it was written to just have the practical instructions for people using the Siddur. So often it's more terse, and there are times when it's debatable as to what exactly the Alter Rebbe means in different circumstances. So in this particular circumstance, about when your talis falls off in the middle of davening and it falls completely off, there are two different, amongst those who discuss it, contemporaries. There are two different ways to understand the Alter Rebbe, but one of the arguments made is that the Alter Rebbe in the Siddur would hold that if you were still wearing your tzitzis, then you don't make another bracha. So even if your talis fell completely to the ground, but because you're still wearing the tzitzis under your shirt, so you are still on some level, quote unquote, connected to the mitzvah of tzitzis, and therefore you don't make a bracha when you put the talis back on. In addition, we said over here that if you put in the beginning, if you take off your talis with the intention of putting it on again immediately, then you don't make another bracha. So when your talis falls off, that's worse, because here you don't have in mind to put it back on immediately. You don't have in mind anything. It fell off without you realizing. So others have argued, and again, it's all debatable, but I'm just presenting the arguments that are out there, that others have argued that if sort of as the talis is slipping off, you don't manage to act quick enough to grab it and catch it before it falls off, but it's quick enough for you to have in mind, my talis is falling off, I'm having in mind right now to put it straight back on, and you have that in mind before it's completely fallen off you, so then that's another way to circumvent the bracha. Now, being that when it comes to brachas, we always say, that we are on the side of caution not to say a bracha in vain. So therefore, practically speaking, I would recommend to follow those opinions that if you are wearing a tzitzis, a talis cotton, which hopefully you are, and your talis falls off, you do not say another bracha. However, if possible, you should also have in mind, as your talis is falling, you're holding the Sefer Torah or whatever it is, your talis is falling off, try have in mind, if you can, before it falls completely off, that you're going to you are going to put it straight back on. Just a moment. Okay. The halacha states that one who borrows without the owner's knowledge is considered a thief. Oh, this is an introduction. It doesn't say this in the Kitzur. Okay. The halacha states that one who borrows without the owner's knowledge is considered a thief. Here we find an exception to this law. When the borrower's purpose is to perform a mitzvah with the object and the owner will not incur any loss, then it is assumed that the owner would be pleased and the borrower may make use of the object. So if you have something lying around, you have a pen lying around. Right now, I think it's safe to assume that you wouldn't mind if I use your pen, provided that I don't go too far with it and I make sure to put it right back. Nevertheless, I have no right to assume that. I have to have your permission to use the pen, and otherwise it's considered a thief. However, if the item I want to borrow is to perform a mitzvah, then I don't need your permission. Again, of course, I should ask your permission if I can, but assuming I have no way of reaching you, then I'm allowed to borrow it without permission, provided that it's to perform a mitzvah, and also that the owner won't incur any loss. So I can't. I don't know if you could argue a pen might be lost because you use up the ink, but I don't know if that counts. But anyway, it's not a mitzvah. But I forget, the Alter Rebbe talks about somewhere about whether or not you're allowed to borrow Sfarim. If I recall correctly, the Alter Rebbe says that you're not allowed to borrow books without permission, because even though it's to perform a mitzvah, to study Torah, but the Sfarim get ruined as you use them. I think that's what the Alter Rebbe says. I'm not 100% sure. Anyway, but now we're going to see how this pertains to the tzitzis. Some go so far as to say that even where the owner explicitly objects, use may be made of his talus. Others have maintained that if the owner is known to be one who would usually object, then it is not permitted to use the article even without specific permission. Still, others go even further and hold that nowadays everyone is assumed to mind and specific permission must be received. So you see, with regard to using some of these talus without permission, there is a very strong, big spectrum, starting from that nowadays everybody is considered to mind, and therefore you can never borrow a talus without permission, going to the other extreme of how someone could take it even when the owner explicitly says that I don't allow you to use it. And then there's the middle approach, which is the approach of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, that it's permissible to borrow someone's talus on an irregular basis. So not to make it your habit, but it so happens, whatever happened, you came to shul, you don't have a talus, even without his knowledge, and use it for prayers and to recite the bracha over it, because it may be assumed that one is pleased that a mitzvah be performed with his property, if it is as no loss to the owner. However, the article may not be removed from the house in which it was placed because the owner may object to that. So you can't go to shul and borrow a talus and then go home and daven with it, or go to another shul to daven with it. If the borrower found the talus folded, he should replace it folded, but on Shabbos he may not fold it, and it may be assumed that since the reason for his not folding it is due to a Shabbos restriction, the owner would not object. So, strictly speaking, you're allowed to borrow somebody else's talus as long as you fold it and put it back nicely, with the exception of Shabbos, when we don't fold the talus on the creases, so you just put it back as nice as you can without folding it precisely. One who borrows a talus from another only for the purpose of going to read for the Torah. Okay, let's pause here a second. Okay, so practically speaking, this halacha may be relied on, although one should try to avoid it. In other words, don't take somebody else's talus without permission if it's not absolutely necessary. And the same would apply, perhaps even more strict, with a hat or a jacket or a gartel. Well, a gartel is a mitzvah, but I don't know. I'm not sure if that would be permissible. Somebody, you don't have a hat and you're accustomed to daven with a hat, and somebody left the hat around. I don't know that it's permissible to, maybe that's considered a mitzvah, but maybe you ruin it. I'm not sure. We could debate that. Sometimes you could have a hat that's left there for a long time, and the shul policy is, there might be a sign by the coat room that says anything left here after 30 days or whatever will be discarded or is considered hefker. So then under that policy. So if the person's left his hat there for 3 months, then perhaps that would be legitimate reason to be able to use his hat or his jacket or something like that. Okay. Now, essentially what he has said here is two things. Number one, that you could borrow the talis. Number two, that you could make the bracha over it. Now, the chiddush of that is that even though the talis, in order for the talis in order for you to be obligated to attach tzitzis to your talis, to your garment, it has to belong to you. So if you're borrowing his talis, how could you make a bracha on it? Nevertheless, there's different opinions as to exactly the mechanisms of this, but the point is that we assume that not only does he allow you to use his talis, but he even allows you to acquire it or to gain ownership of it, at least to the extent necessary to allow the bracha. What if you're borrowing it not to wear as a talis, but just for a sort of an external reason? So he says like this. If you borrow it, one who borrows a talis from another only for the purpose of going up to reach from the Torah, there is a halachic question if halacha is to be recited, and therefore you should specifically not intend not to acquire the talis. Thereby, according to all opinions, you are not required to recite a bracha. What that means is like this. There could be a number of reasons why a person would want a talis. One is because your custom is either because you're married or you've been married or you're Sephardi and you wear a talis from a younger age. Whatever the case is, it's your custom to daven with a talis. You came to shul without a talis, so now you wear the talis. You need to borrow a talis for davening. What if you're not borrowing it for davening, but for another reason? Now, nowadays, the vast majority of Chabad shuls never require you to wear a talis for any reason. Not to get an aliyah, not to reach from not to lane, not to daven for the Amid Mincha Ma'ariv. Actually, is an exception. First of all, to daven for the Amid Slichas, and the days before Rosh Hashanah, and also for a Kohen to Duchen, who wears a talis. Interesting history is that was not always the Chabad practice. It used to be. In fact, some argue that it never really changed, and there are some Chabad shuls who still maintain the practice that if the majority of the minyan are wearing a talis, so if it's a minyan yeshiva, then it doesn't matter because nobody's wearing a talis. But if it's a minyan, let's say a regular shul where most of the people there are wearing talisim, so then if a bacher gets an aliyah or something like that, that he should also wear a talis. That was the minhag back in the day in 770, and the whole history how it changed and whatever the case is. But the bottom line is that there's all these reasons why a person would wear a talis, not for the intrinsic purpose of wearing a talis, but for an external reason. You wear a talis because that's considered respectful to the congregation whom you are going to present by getting an aliyah or reading from the Torah or laning, etc. And a kohen, of course, for duchening also wears a talis just for a few minutes to cover his head and his hands while he duchens. So in those cases, there's a question whether or not you should recite a bracha over here because you're not really wearing it for the mitzvah. You're just wearing it for this external reason. So therefore, if you're borrowing somebody else's talis, then you should have in mind explicitly that you are not acquiring it, and then you will not need to make him a bracha. That's all if it's an individual's talis. What if it's the congregation's talis, which is most common today, right? If you go to a shul where it's the custom for you to wear a talis, if you get an aliyah, they'll probably have a pile of talisim near the bima, and everyone who comes up, if you go to, let's say, for example, locally, if you go to your shurin on Shabbos Mincha, everyone who gets an aliyah wears a talis, and they have talisim on the bima for you to take. So he says if it belongs to the shul, if it's a congregation's talis, then even if you're only going to get an aliyah for the Torah, or to duchen, or whatever it is, you are required to recite the bracha because it's considered as if it were yours. Nevertheless, the prevalent custom is not like that. I mean, you could go and take a look. You'll see in Yeshurun, go there, Shabbos Mincha, you'll see people go up, take a talis to get an aliyah, and they do not say a bracha, and that is the prevalent custom not to say a bracha on the talis of the shul if you're just wearing it for an aliyah. If you're taking a talis of the shul to daven with, then you do say a bracha on it. Okay. Sif Yud Beis is not so commonly relevant nowadays, but we'll read it as it is. When the Torah refers to wall, or when the Paskim do so, they usually mean sheep's or ram's wool. A pious person should not recite the bracha of a talis in which the warp threads are made of wool and the woof threads are made of cotton, silk, or the like, or the reverse. That is, that the woof threads are made of wool and the warp threads are made of another material, because some poskim maintain that even tzitzis made of wool only exempt a garment made of the same material. What that means to say is like this. Any material, you can make the tzitzis, the strings, out of any material, but they must be the same material as the garment. So if you have a silk garment with 4 corners, then your strings have to be silk. If you have a cotton garment with 4 corners, the strings have to be cotton, etc. The exception to that rule is wool. Woolen tzitzis work for any type of garment. So if you have cotton tzitzis, this is the common practice. Many people wear cotton tzitzis. Our custom, Chabad custom, is to only wear woolen tzitzis. And again, something which the Rabbi pushed on a number of occasions very, very strongly. I recall a story of somebody who had an allergy to wool, and the Rabbi promised him that if he would do it for the mitzvah of tzitzis, it wouldn't have any adverse effect on him. But strictly speaking, you could wear cotton tzitzis, and you could use, and the woolen tzitzis are okay. It's a cotton garment, woolen tzitzis, and that's fine. But what he's saying over here is that you should not wear, ideally, you should not recite the bracha over a talis that has a mixture. So what he calls the warp threads and the woof threads means shasi and erev. Horizontal threads are, let's say, wool, and the vertical threads are cotton, silk, or the like. So then there are opinions that that's no good, so therefore you should avoid such a talis. Again, it's not a common thing nowadays. Nowadays, basically, all the tzitzis and the talisim on the market are either wool or cotton. Similarly, over a talis made of silk, the tzitzis are made of wool, a bracha is not said. Rather, you should first recite the bracha over a woolen talis, wrap yourself in it and remove it, and then wrap yourself with a silk talis. However, if the tzitzis of the silk talis were also made of silk, then you may recite the bracha. Tzitzis of silk are not common in our countries because tzitzis must be spun for the purpose of tzitzis. If the tzitzis were partially made of silk and partially of wool, it's even worse. It's more questionable and therefore should not be made in this manner. Okay, we're not going to go too much into depth in this because, again, I don't think this is a very practical thing. Okay, Sif Yud Gimel is a very practical thing that happens all the time, and often gets a little. It's actually a very complicated topic with many different opinions, but obviously we're just going to learn it as he summarizes it here. In that we're learning the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is the abridged version of this. So in Shulchan Aruch, I'll just show you. This is about when one of the strings gets damaged. I'm not sure if you could see the screen that I'm scrolling now, but I just want to see. Okay, it's going to take me too long to find this, but basically in Shulchan Aruch, here we go. Nifsuchu Tzitzis. Hold on. Bear with me. Right, it's 35. The strings of the tzitzis. This chapter is 35 seifim in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, all the laws of the strings, and here it's condensed just into one paragraph. Practically, what we need to know. Okay, can you see the screen now? See if Gimel 13. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Remember, introduction. We've discussed this in the past. That the tzitzis that we have 8 strings. Really, it's 4 strings which are folded in half. Okay, a tzitzis from which a tzitzah is the singular for tzitzis, so 1 string, from which a string tore from the 4 strings that are folded over to form 8 strings, and enough remain to allow the tying of a bow that is 4 thumb breadths, or if 2 strings tore but each had 4 thumb breadths left, and the other 2 strings remain complete with the prescribed size, the tzitzis is valid. However, if 3 of the tzitzis strings tore, even if there remains from each string 4 thumb breadths, and the 4th string is complete, or if the tear was only or if the tear was even in only 1 thread, and there did not remain 4 tambrats, even though the other 3 threads are complete, it is nevertheless invalid unless it's an emergency. Okay, so this is sort of a little bit abstract, and in the second half of the sif, he's going to make it more practical. What he's saying is that we have 8 strings, but think of it as 4 strings. If one or 2 of the 4 strings rip, and they're enough to make a little bow from them, he says it must be 4 tambrats. The Alter Rebbe says it can be even less than that. If there's enough to make a little bow from what's left of either 1 or 2 of the 4 strings, then that's fine. But if 3 strings rip, then that's not okay. Okay, now let's translate that into the scenario, which the way we look at the tzitzis as being 8, not 4. Therefore, if 1 string tears from the 8 strings which are hanging, even if it tore completely up to the links, it is certainly valid, since 1 string is only half of a larger string. So again, I'll take out my colors from the drawer here to demonstrate. Right, you have here the 5 knots, and then you have here the 8 strings. So I have here 8 strings, 4 in each hand. If let's say one of these ones rips, even if it rips all the way up to the knot over here, the tzitzis are still valid. Why? Because that 1 string that ripped still has the other half of it on the other side. Remember, right? These are all the same strings. So let's give the strings number. These strings in my right hand over here are 1, 2, 3, and 4, and the other sides of them are 5, 6, 7, and 8. Right? So if string number 1 rips all the way up to the knot, its counterpart, which is going to be string number 5, is still complete. So that's fine. Therefore, let's read that again. If 1 string tears from the 8 strings which are hanging, even if it tore completely up to the links, it is certainly valid, since this 1 string is only half of a larger string, and there's still enough left in the other half to tie a bow and even more. If 2 strings tore and there did not remain in each one 4 tambrats, then it depends. If there is the possibility that those strings are really parts of 1 string, then the tzitzis is invalid. Okay, so what happens if 2 strings rip? Now, remember last week we discussed that in the process of tying and preparing the tzitzis, we keep a mark, an identifying mark, to make sure that the 4 strings that we use on either side to make the double knot are the same 4 that we're going to use next time. And the reason for that is because we want, is that clear what I'm saying? Right? The reason for that is because we want strings 1, 2, 3, and 4 to be the opposite ends of strings 5, 6, 7, and 8. If one of the times that I made the knot, I mixed up and used a different 4 for each side, then it's possible that I have in this hand strings 1, 2, and 3, and 4, that actually 2 of these are a whole string. So the only way to make sure that I have the 4 strings split equally is to make sure I'm keeping track of that down the line. And the usage of that is that if I kept track when I was tying the tzitzis to keep them separate, so now if I have 2 strings from one, if let's say strings 1 and 2 rip, even if they rip all the way up to the knot, I can be certain that they are not the same string because they're on the same side of the knot. So as long as my strings on the other side of the knot are intact, I'm fine. But if I didn't keep track and I have 2 strings tied, 2 strings ripped up to the knot, then they may be the same string, and that would render it invalid. Now, what happens if I have string 1 and string 5 rip all the way up to the knot? Now there is already a chance that that's really the same string. It's possible that string 1 and 5 are the same. And therefore, if they both ripped all the way up to here, and I don't have enough to make a loop, then it's invalid. But if strings, one second. However, if it is certain that they are from 2 separate strings, for example, if at the time of tying, he was careful to always tie the 4 ends on one side with the 4 ends on the other side, as I've already mentioned in paragraph 5, and now there is a tear in 2 of the ends located on one side of the knot, in this particular case, it is certain that the tears were in 2 separate strings, and since there is still And since there still is in each string the amount of 4 thumb breadths, and even more on the second side of the knot, and the other 2 strings are complete, the tzitzah is valid. Okay? So if I have 2 strings on the same side rip, that's okay. Even if I have three strings ripped on the same side, so then it would not be valid anymore if they're all the way up to the knot, right? That's what he said in the beginning, that if you have 3, then it's no good. Right? However, if 3 of the tzitzis string, even if it remains, then it's not complete. Then it's no good. In all of these cases, it is certainly preferable, if possible, to have tzitzis that all the strings are intact. That's certainly an ideal. And certainly, as your strings are getting more and more ripped, it's probably time to move on to a new pair of tzitzis, if possible. And I think it's important to remember that a lot of the cases here where we'll say, in time of need, you can get away with this. We're talking about different times where things weren't, the society wasn't as affluent and tzitzis weren't as readily available from the store for $20. And nowadays, it's certainly much easier to be mahadr to make sure we have beautiful tzitzis. Now, that's all we've spoken about if the strings rip over here, in the string part of it. If one string tears at the point where they hang in the hole, then the whole thing is invalid, right? So if you have over here, one of them rips over here, or if one of the strings rip inside over here. So if you notice over here, in the middle of the knot and wrapping sections, there you go, it's clear to see without the light on, right? If this part, if the string gets ripped over there, then it's invalid. We mentioned that if one string tears and there remains a sufficient amount to tie a bow, then the tzitzis is valid. This is only if at the time of making the tzitzis, all the strings were proper length, except that afterwards they tore. However, at the time of making the tzitzis, remember last week we said the proper length is 12 thumb breadths. However, if at the time of making the tzitzis, there was even only one string that was slightly shorter than the prescribed length, the tzitzah is invalid. So at the time of tying the tzitzis, they must be long enough to be kosher. If they later rip, then these are the prescriptions. Okay, the string of the tzitzah, one second. The string of the tzitzah must be twisted, and if any string becomes unraveled from its twistedness, then any unraveled part is considered as if it were cut off and does not exist. So that's quite common, that at the end of the tzitzis, the piece just fell off. But it's quite common that at the end of the tzitzis, it should become unraveled, so that unraveled part does not count towards the length of the tzitzis. Okay, so this refers back to Tasav Elimina also. We've discussed this in the past, that when the tzitzis are tied onto the garment, the garment must be chayiv b'tzitzis at that moment. So he's talking here about a large talis with a seam down the middle, whose tzitzis are validly attached and is separated at the seam for the purpose of facilitating the handling of the talis during laundering or mending. So imagine you have apparently this was common. He says later that this was common. That you would have a big talis, and down the middle there was some sort of seam that you could detach the two parts, which made it easier for laundering, and then you would sew them back together again. So now you've detached them, and in each half of it, you have 2 tzitzis hanging. We thus have 2 talesim with 2 tzitzis on each. We are now faced with the problem that sewing the 2 halves together again would result in validating the talis for the mitzvah through an act not done directly to the tzitzis. Thus, Tasav Elimina Asui comes a problem. So he goes like this. This paragraph deals with a talis that has tzitzis attached and was divided into 2, as is common with many of our talesim. Okay, so apparently this was common. They're sewn together from separate sections. Occasionally, the sections are separated in order to launder it or to mend it and is then restitched. Since there is usually enough left in each section to enwrap a person, it is sufficient to remove 2 of the tzitzis from any section and after restitching the talis to retie the tzitzis. So what he's saying is, because each half of those are big enough garment to warrant the garment obligated in tzitzis, so any 2 of the 4 are valid, right? Anytime you put on tzitzis, you don't put on the 4 simultaneously. You put on 1, then you put on the other one, then the third one, then the fourth one. So the fact that you only have 2 on one and 2 on the other, any 2 of them, you could choose any 2 of them to be the ones that have to be untied and retied. In fact, in this particular case, the Alter Rebbe rules even more leniently, and the Alter Rebbe says that because if each one of the 2 halves are big enough to be obligated in tzitzis themselves, then you don't have to untie any of them. All right. However, if each section is not large enough to enwrap a person, he must first remove all the tzitzis, because when the sections were separated, each part is exempt from the mitzvah of tzitzis. And when they are later reattached and require tzitzis, then if the original tzitzis remain, the talis is invalid because of tasav and also, as was mentioned previously. If in one section there is sufficient amount left to enwrap, and in another section there is not enough, then he should remove the tzitzis from the part that does not have enough to enwrap a person. Okay. Again, we're not going to elaborate on this too much because, again, I don't think it's very commonly practical. If the corner of the talis was either cut or torn and became completely separated from the talis, then the area of that piece is less than 3 thumb breadths by 3 thumb breadths. There are those who maintain that this piece, even after it is resewn properly into the talis, is invalid for attaching tzitzis to it. Right? So we've already discussed that you can't take off this string and sort of sew it onto another garment. What about this whole section? Can I cut off this whole section of the talis, this corner section, and sew it onto another talis, that, not just the strings itself, but the strings together with a little piece of fabric? So here it's a machlokes, but nevertheless, there are those who maintain that this piece, even after it is resewn, is still invalid for attaching tzitzis to it. The reason for this is, since there is not in this piece 3 thumb breadths by 3 thumb breadths, it is not considered to be a garment, right? We're talking here about a very small piece. You're only cutting off a very small piece of fabric together with it, and the small piece is not big enough to be a garment, so therefore it's not good enough. And therefore, even if it is attached to the talis, it is still considered as separated, and therefore we should adhere to this strict view. So imagine you get a rip in your talis right over here. Your talis rips down over here. This whole piece becomes disconnected. So it's the piece with the tzitzis on and the little tiny piece of fabric together with it that's less than this 3 thumb breadths by 3 thumb breadths. So then you should be strict and not resew that piece of fabric to the talis. However, if the piece is not separated completely from the talis, as long as it remains slightly attached, so you got a rip, but it didn't rip off, it's still connected, then resewing it to the talis is sufficient for the piece to be considered a part of the talis, and the tzitzis that will be attached after resewing the piece are valid. So as long as it remained attached on some level, you can resew it. The custom is to sew a piece of cloth 3 by 3 in the corners of the talis, because in many garments, even if they are new, there are pieces of cloth attached which are less than 3 agudlim or 3 agudlim. We therefore sew the place that we attach the tzitzis, a piece of cloth 3 agudlim by 3 agudlim. What he's saying is that apparently it used to be common in garments, at the edges of garments, to have sort of small pieces of fabric somehow stitched together to create the full garment. So there's the concern that the tzitzis itself, where the hole for the tzitzis to attach to the garment are going to be attached on a small piece of fabric that is a piece of fabric less than 3 by 3 attached to the rest of the garment, and that, according to this opinion, would be problematic. And so the solution is to put a piece on the corner to attach a piece of garment that is one whole cloth that's bigger than the size of 3 by 3, and that's therefore you're safe. And indeed, this is the common practice, right? We all have Chabad customers that it should be silk, but it doesn't have to be silk. It could be any materials, really. Some have cotton. a little piece of fabric over here, and this custom remains till today, that on the four corners of both your small talis and your big talis, your tzitzis and your talis, have a little piece of fabric on the inside on the corner, and that's because the concern was that on this side, maybe the small pieces of fabric which comprise the corner, so we circumvent that. Okay, we have here a good introduction over here to number 17. Rashi's opinion is that any thread used in the stitching of the corner of the garment should be of material other than the tzitzis. This is because there is concern that one may leave some of the sewing thread dangling from the corner and then combine it with 3 other strings for tzitzis. Since his original intent for this thread was stitching and not tzitzis, it cannot become part of the tzitzis merely by his decision to consider it so, and this constitutes ta'aseh b'liminasa. Right? So we are concerned that if you use over here to sew the hem, so to speak, the seam of the talis, you use a woolen thread. So that woolen thread is not there for tzitzis use, it's there for stitching use. But then you might say, hey, here's a string, and you'll tie it together and use it as part of your strings and render it invalid. So therefore we make sure that any other thread around this area of the talis should not be of the same material, of the wool material that the strings are made of. Some authorities hold that on the entire area of the corner which is eligible for attaching the tzitzis, that is, from after the length of 3 thumb knuckles from the edge of the talis until the length of 3 thumb breadths. So we learned that last week, the exact space in where the hole has to be pierced for attaching the tzitzis. There should not be any stitches whatsoever with the thread that may be used in the making of tzitzis for this particular talis. For example, if the talis were made of linen, or should not sew it with linen threads, but only use silk threads and the like. Likewise, if the talis is silk, it should not be sewn with silk threads. If the talis is made of wool, it should not be sewn with woolen threads, but with silk threads or the like. It's preferable to adhere to this strict view, also in regard to the hem that is made around the hole to reinforce it. All above, however, applies only to white thread, but with colored thread, there is no reason for concern. So all the, again, and briefly, all the thread that we use to tie the hem over here, and also the seam that's made here around the hole to reinforce the hole should be made of another material other than the material of the talis. Nowadays, I'm fairly certain that it's always those threads are probably almost always just some sort of synthetic polyester or whatever it is. And then he says it doesn't apply to white; it only applies to white threads. Again, a little bit beyond the scope to explain all the details of the colored thread, but that's okay. If you wish to remove the tzitzis from the talis in order to reattach replacement tzitzis which are more beautiful, or because one of the threads tore and you wish to attach complete ones, although the original tzitzis are still valid, it is nevertheless permissible to remove them since you are not nullifying the talis from the mitzvah of tzitzis. On the contrary, you will be attaching more beautiful tzitzis. However, you should be careful not to throw the original tzitzis in a disrespectful place. And so, stamazoi, just to remove tzitzis for the heck of it, that's obviously disrespectful. We don't do that. But if you're removing the tzitzis to replace them with better ones, with more kosher ones, with more beautiful ones, then that's fine. And the old tzitzis should be discarded in a respectful way. So you could put them in, strictly speaking, you could put them into a bag and put that bag in the garbage, and that way they remain sort of clean or protected. It's certainly, the pasuk talk about burning them with the chametz or making a fire and burning them, but not to put them that they should end up in sort of a filthy dump. And then the even better, holier way of doing it, now the Rebbe says, is to actually, it's super duper good to put them in geniza, to put them together with all the shemus. And the same applies with this little string that fell off. I'm going to put it right now in my shemus drawer, and that's the custom, if possible, to put it with the shemus. Now, you can also use it. Okay, we'll see. Yeah, even tzitzis that have become invalid and were removed from the talis should not be thrown into the trash because it shows disrespect. Some people are careful to place them in a holy book and use them as a bookmark. This doesn't mean just to keep them in the book for storing them. The idea is that you use it for another mitzvah. So you use it as a bookmark to keep your place in the book that you're studying Torah from. For since they were used to perform a mitzvah, then they should be used for another mitzvah. Likewise, a talis that is aged and is no longer worn as a mitzvah should not be used or disposed of in a disrespectful manner. I should also point out that if you're removing the tzitzis from the garment, then it says you shouldn't cut them with a metal blade. We don't want the tzitzis to be cut by metal blade, so you could pull them apart with your hands. You could use a glass blade if you have one. Don't tell the dentist I said this, but you could use your teeth to rip them apart, but don't use a metal blade to cut them. Hold on. Okay. Okay. It is important to note that wearing a four-cornered garment without valid tzitzis is not merely a failure to perform a mitzvah, but rather a transgression, because the Torah prohibits the wearing of a four-cornered garment without tzitzis. Now, what happens if you go to... Okay, so here I need to introduce something over here. There is no negative prohibition in the Torah that says, thou shalt not wear a four-cornered garment without tzitzis. It's a positive mitzvah. If you have a four-cornered garment, then you have to put tzitzis in it. So, what happens if you're wearing... So if a person is wearing tzitzis is wearing the garment of the talis without strings in them, so he is in violation of a positive mitzvah. What if you're not able to perform the positive mitzvah? For example, it's Shabbos. Now, what's the mitzvah? The mitzvah is to tie strings onto them. On Shabbos, it's forbidden to tie strings. So if it were a negative mitzvah, thou shalt not wear tzitzis without a four-cornered garment without tzitzis, then you're in violation. You're not allowed to wear this garment. Take it off, right? But it's not a negative mitzvah, it's a positive mitzvah. You should go and tie strings. Comes along Shabbos and says, no, you're not allowed to tie strings today. So therefore, on a biblical level, it would technically be permissible to wear a talis without strings on Shabbos, because there's a positive mitzvah to tie strings. There's another mitzvah, of Shabbos that overrides that mitzvah. And so, no pun intended, your hands are tied. You can't tie the tzitzis on the talis, and therefore, on a biblical level, it would be permissible to wear that talis on Shabbos. However, on a rabbinic level, we say no, because the Torah has a mitzvah that you must put tzitzis on this garment. So the Chachamim, the sages, enact a rabbinic negative commandment that says don't wear a talis without tzitzis. So when in wearing a talis without tzitzis, you are in violation of a biblical positive mitzvah. But in case of oinus, in case beyond your choice, like for example Shabbos, then okay, so I'm told to do something which I have no ability to do, so too bad. But then you have the rabbinical commandment of thou shalt not wear the talis without tzitzis. Now, the practical relevance of that is that if there's a rabbinic commandment that it will cause a person humiliation, then the Chachamim say that their mitzvah goes to the side. So that leads into the scenario of Sif Chaf that says if you go to shul on Shabbos and discover that your tzitzis of your talis has become invalid, and you're unable to borrow another talis, and you're embarrassed to sit, it's humiliating for you. You're going to be sitting in shul without a talis. It's going to be tremendously embarrassing. So then, since it's not possible for you to tie another tzitzit this day, so therefore, biblically speaking, there's nothing you could do. And it's merely a rabbinic mitzvah that says you're not allowed to wear it anyway. Therefore, for the sake of your dignity, kavet habrios, for your dignity, you're permitted to wear the talis as is, but obviously you should not recite the bracha. This is applicable only if you were unaware before Shabbos that the tzitzit became invalid, but if you knew before Shabbos that it became invalid, you're forbidden to wear the talis since you have fixed it the day before. Okay? If a garment that requires tzitzis is worn without tzitzis, this constitutes a transgression of a positive mitzvah. We must be careful about certain garments that are made with 4 corners. One corner must be cut so that it becomes rounded, right? So if you have a 4-cornered garment that for whatever reason you don't want to put tzitzis on, you have to cut a corner round. So for example, the Chabad kapata, the frak, surtuk, whatever you call it. So, okay, let's finish this eve. However, if the corner was merely folded and sewn, sewed it so it appears round, it's not sufficient because as long as it's not cut, it's still considered part of the garment, right? So it doesn't help to fold it and sew it over so that it looks round. You have to actually cut it so the corner is round. And he finishes off the chapter by saying, "Great is the punishment of one who negates the mitzvah of tzitzis. One who is scrupulous in this mitzvah will be worthy to behold the divine presence." So certainly if you have a garment that's obligated in tzitzis, you have to either put on tzitzis or cut the corners round. Now there are many garments which have 4 corners, which it's questionable whether or not they're obligated in tzitzis, and one of them is the kapata. The kapata has 4 corners because in the front, the bottom, those 2 corners are square, and in the back, it has a slit all the way, more than half of the way up. So there's a suffix whether that's considered, it's not really a garment with 4 corners, 2 in the front and 2 in the back, like you think of a tzitzis, but it technically has 4 corners, and therefore you will notice that the back corner of your kapata, one of the corners is round. Now, if you happen to notice that the tailor made a mistake, this has happened to me before, that you see somebody in shul that the corners of his kapata are all square, are cornered. So in that case, so then well, first of all, even if you hold that a kapata would be obligated in tzitzis if it had 4 corners, but in that case, you have like we said before, that if the person would be embarrassing for him to sit in shul without his kapata, so then on Shabbos you have this permissibility that you could wear it without tzitzis, and then after Shabbos, point it out to the guy and tell him, take your kapata to the cleaners and have them cut one of the corners round. Now, there's a lot of discussion about different garments. The most practical thing is blankets. Now, the Alter Rebbe asks Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that you have to cut one of the corners of your blankets and your sheets round. The common practice is not to do so, and there's some discussion b'chlal whether a blanket is considered you usually don't wear the blanket around you. You lie underneath it, or if it's a sheet, you might lie on top of it. There's a number of reasons limudei schus given as to why we don't wear. It's not the custom to cut the corners of the blanket round, but the main reason is because it's a beged laila, because the blankets are on your bed, which is a nighttime activity. Even though by the time you wake up, certainly in the summer, it may be already a couple of hours into the daytime. But because blankets on your bed are b'etzem and night garments, that would be another reason to be more lenient. However, it's common nowadays that people might have blankets on their couch, which is a daytime activity. You sit on the couch during the day, and you may use those blankets not just to lie underneath, but even to wrap yourself around if you're a bit cold. And therefore, it's certainly appropriate to cut the corners of those blankets, one of the corners, to cut one of the corners round. And there's some discussion as to whether or not we need to have a tzitzis on synthetic materials. So practically speaking, for example, a poncho that you wear in the rain often has 4 corners. But then there's 2 reasons to be lenient. One is because it's made of synthetic material, and another reason is that you're not really wearing it as a garment. You're wearing it to protect your garments from the rain. And so we are lenient. We don't require you to cut one of the corners of the poncho round. Okay, that ends the siman on tzitzis. Next week We'll start the next chapter, which is the laws of tefillin. We did have a little bit more in-depth discussion on tzitzis, and we covered some time back in the Sunday morning class, and we covered many different aspects of it. And I'm going to upload this class to YouTube, and I will post the link to those other classes in the description on the YouTube video. So if you want to further research, you could listen to those classes. Okay, good night. Torah and 10 starts in 4 minutes.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi.
Good night.